All right, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everyone. This is a very nice opportunity to share my research. While I'm sharing my screen, I'm doing my PhD on food environment in Ethiopia. And when I started my PhD, I was just dreaming of such a network. So it's very impressive that this African food environment research network has been put in place. So big congrats to everybody involved in that. So as I said, I'm doing my PhD at Wageningen University in collaboration with Addis Ababa University, IRD, and A4NH. Can everybody see the slides? All right, good. So I want to present, this is one of my papers, of my PhD, which is on policy actions for healthy food environments in Ethiopia to prevent malnutrition in all its forms. So as a starting point, we took the INFORMAS Food Epi framework to understand which domains have been identified under this Food Epi module, to see what elements of the food environment should we be looking for in the policy documents. So this is what we used as a starting point to find policy actions in policy documents in Ethiopia. But we also wanted to look at other frameworks to see how the frameworks that put the food environment in the bigger context of the food system. So this helped us identify other potential domains such as food quality and food safety, but also look more broadly at some of these domains, for example, food composition and processing, to also look at agricultural production in this respect, but I get to that later. And we were also interested in some of the outcomes of the food environment and wanted to look at those, to look at the domains, but also expand it a little bit to other components of the food system. So we used this framework for our study, basically the food environment domains of the Food Epi framework. On top of that, we included food quality and food safety. We used these domains to identify and code the policy actions in policy documents, and at the same time we looked for potential outcomes in diets and nutritional status, which we identified and coded as part of the policy goals in policy documents. So the objectives of the review were to contribute novel insights to the application and scope of the Food Epi tool in low and middle income countries like Ethiopia, and also provide input to priority setting of the programming and policy making in Ethiopia for healthier food environments. So the questions we were asking: how are these food environment domains currently addressed in the policy documents? How do they relate to the Food Epi benchmarks? And how are these domains also linked to potential dietary and nutritional outcomes? But in this presentation, I will focus mostly on the first two questions. So the methodology we applied was for the data collection, we used an institutional approach because it was not possible to delineate food environment as a concept, because there was no policy document as such labeled as a food environment document. So we used an institutional approach, which means basically we identified all the institutions and ministries that since 2008, when the first national nutrition strategy has been launched, has expressed any commitment for food and nutrition, and then started out with these institutions and ministries to identify policy outputs from those ministries. And these policy outputs could include strategies, plans, policies, regulations, but also other legal documents. So they had to be published after 2008, when the first nutrition strategy was launched, and had to have a food or nutrition objective or related action or recommendation. For the data analysis, we used the software NVivo and developed codes based on the framework that I shared previously, developed codes on all the concepts from our framework, and then coded all the actions and goals we identified in the documents, and then also compared them with the INFORMAS global indicators. We also did a historical analysis, which I'm not presenting in this presentation. So based on this, on these different searches and the documents we had collected already, it resulted in 127 documents, but we had to exclude some because they were either too old or didn't have a food and nutrition goal or action. So this resulted in 38 policy outputs, so not just policies, but strategies, plans, and programs, and legal documents, with most of them coming from the Food and Drug Administration. So this is just to show you what the food environment domains were that we identified in the policy documents. And you can see that food quality and food safety was the most dominant one in the policy documents, followed by food composition and processing. But this is to say, because obviously food composition and processing looks also quite prominent there, we expanded this beyond the indicators of the food AP framework. So we also looked at agro-processing, for example, and for food fortification, which might make it look more prominent than some of the other domains. So now I just wanted to give you some examples, because I can't go through all the indicators. So to just give some examples of the food composition and processing indicator, which is about setting standards and targets for the content of nutrients of concern in industrially processed foods. So what we found that there are standards, but they're set for several mostly unprocessed food items. So basically it's just a list of nutrients that certain food should contain. So we found that food standards in this respect, and in terms of reformulation, we found only a proposal to replace trans fats and saturated fats with mono and polyunsaturated fats, and to reduce salt. So we only found a proposal in this respect. What we did find in addition, though, was data related to agro-processing. So we found policy actions on agro-processing of meat, milk, and also honey and sugar. But also in the nutrition-sensitive agriculture strategy, agro-processing was mentioned to ensure consumption of nutritious food. So selecting value chains of specifically nutrient-rich crops was a policy action we identified. And also fortification of edible oil, flour, and salt. So these are obviously all actions that could influence what is available or affordable, what types of food are available or affordable in the food environment. So we considered them also as relevant. In terms of food prices, the indicators are including a reduction of taxes on healthy foods, which we found no evidence on. Another indicator was to increase taxes on healthy foods, and there was in 2009 already an excise tax on all types of soft drinks, which was expanded in 2020 to foods high in beverages in sugar, trans fats, and saturated fats. And for the indicator on existing food subsidies favoring healthy foods, we also found no evidence. However, we did find evidence on policy actions related to subsidies for sugar, edible oil, and wheat. So this is what we found quite relevant also to consider. In terms of food retail, the indicators about zoning laws on density and location of healthy and unhealthy food services. We found no evidence on this in terms of policy action. However, we found a recognition of the fact that availability and access in urban areas and in the vicinity of adolescents could play a role in their decision making. And we also found proposals to ensure safety and quality of vendors in the food environment. In addition, we found data that was relevant for rural but also informal markets. To just give an example, there was a policy action on building market centers, particularly for perishable foods like fruits and vegetables, animal food, or honey collection and processing, which we also found relevant with regards to food retail. So this is just to quickly give some suggestions on what we concluded as potential additional good practice indicators from what we found in the Ethiopia example, that agro-processing and food fortification would be relevant to look at. And it was nice to see in the presentation from Milka that she also highlighted food fortification as an important component, because obviously it depends what type of food is processed at the agricultural level or at food fortification level. That could determine the availability and affordability of certain foods in the food environment. And then also we found relevant policy actions that addressed informal market or rural markets, which there's a very good evidence from Vietnam on how, for example, the retail formalization could influence what food is available and affordable at markets. And then also we found the policy actions on subsidies of unhealthy foods quite relevant. And also there are examples from Egypt, for example, of subsidies of white flour or bread that could actually lead to unhealthy behaviors. And lastly, this is not something I presented, but could be relevant to consider policy actions, to do benchmark policy actions targeting school food environments. And then in terms of policy actions and recommendations for Ethiopia, as I've shown, we saw a lot of policy actions that they were dominant by food quality and safety. So there's a need for more coherent actions related to some of the other domains, which would be very helpful once the food-based dietary guidelines that are currently under development in Ethiopia would probably help a lot to allow more coherent and integrated actions, particularly for food prices or promotion or labeling, to define what is a healthy or unhealthy food in the Ethiopian context. And then another recommendation we found relevant is food subsidies for healthy foods such as fruits and vegetables, because there is evidence that prices for fruits and vegetables are increasing, so that the poorest households cannot even afford to consume the recommended amounts. So thank you very much. I also wanted to thank the institutions that were involved in this study, and obviously the government focal persons that gave their time and shared the policy documents. Thank you.